Please, Mama Renata, don't leave me here. I'll be good, I promise." Luna's tiny voice cracked, her arms outstretched, fingers desperately clawing at the empty air between her and her stepmother. Renata stopped abruptly, her heels grinding into the dirt as she turned back, her face twisted in a mix of disgust and irritation. "Good? What does that even mean coming from you, huh?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the thick forest air. "Do you even understand how much of my life you've ruined? How sick I am of wiping your messes, cleaning up after you, bathing you like you're some helpless little animal." Luna flinched, the words hitting her like stones. I can try harder. I won't make any messes, I promise. Please, just don't leave me." Her large, teary eyes stared up at Renata, her trembling hands gripping the sides of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Renata let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed through the trees. "Try harder. You can't even stand up. You can't do anything without someone holding your pathetic little hands. Do you think I married your father so I could spend my life waiting on a crippled child?" Her voice was cruel and unrelenting, and her eyes burned with disdain. Luna's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking as she reached for Renata. "Please don't go! Don't leave me here, Mama Renata!" Renata's lip curled in disgust as she took a step back, her arms crossing over her chest. "Stop calling me that," she hissed. "I'm not your mother, and I never wanted to be. You're nothing to me, Luna. Nothing but dead weight." She turned sharply and began walking away, her steps deliberate, heels crunching against the dry leaves. "Wait, please!" Luna cried out, reaching forward with all her might. Her small fingers managed to graze Renata's sleeve, but the older woman jerked her arm away in irritation. The sudden motion threw Luna off balance. The wheelchair tipped violently, and Luna toppled forward with a cry of terror. Her frail body hit the ground with a sickening thud, her thin arms flailing as she tried to catch herself. The damp earth smeared across her face and hands as she lay there, gasping in pain and shock. Renata stopped and turned her head slightly, her gaze cold as ice, as she stared at the pitiful figure sprawled on the forest floor. "See?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "You can't even stay upright. What a joke!" Luna whimpered, her small hands scraping against the dirt as she tried to push herself up, her useless legs dragging behind her. "Please, I can't. I need help," she choked out, her sobs muffled by the leaves. Renata tilted her head, feigning thoughtfulness. "Help?" she sneered. "You think I'm going to waste another second cleaning up after you? This is better for everyone, especially me. Now, stay there and cry all you want. It's not like you're going anywhere." With that, she turned and strode away, the sound of her heels growing fainter with each step. Luna reached out weakly, her voice hoarse as she cried, "Mama Renata, please don't go." Her small body trembled as she tried to crawl forward, but her arms gave out, leaving her collapsed in the dirt. The forest seemed to swallow her retreating figure, the sound of her heels fading into nothingness. Luna's cries grew frantic, her voice tearing through the silence of the woods. Her hands clawed weakly at the ground as she struggled to lift herself, her legs utterly unresponsive beneath her. "No, no, no," she whimpered, tears mingling with the dirt on her cheeks. She tried to push herself upright, but her arms trembled and gave out, dropping her back onto the unforgiving ground. "Help! Somebody, please!" Her voice echoed through the trees, but no answer came. The stillness of the forest pressed down on her, broken only by the sound of distant, rustling leaves. Her breath hitched as the shadows around her seemed to shift, shapes moving where none should be. A sharp snap of a branch made her flinch, her wide eyes darting toward the source. "Hello?" she called out weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Is someone there? Silence, and then a low growl. Luna froze, her fingers digging into the ground. The growl grew louder, closer, until a dark shape emerged from the shadows. A wolf. Its eyes gleamed like twin shards of ice, locked onto her motionless form. The beast's movements were slow and deliberate, each step closer making her heart hammer against her ribs. "No," she breathed, her voice quaking. "Please, no." The wolf's lips pulled back to reveal sharp, glistening teeth. And then it stopped, just a few feet away, crouching low, its body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Luna's heart pounded in her chest, so loud it seemed to echo in her ears. The wolf's lips curled back, exposing razor-sharp fangs. Before she could even scream, it lunged. The massive creature launched itself into the air, its jaws open, teeth gleaming under the faint light. Luna let out a piercing scream, her eyes squeezing shut as her hands shot up in a futile attempt to shield herself. She braced for the searing pain, for the claws and teeth that would tear into her flesh. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, her body rigid, her mind paralyzed with terror. All she could hear was the rush of her own blood in her ears and the deafening sound of her scream reverberating into the night. And then, nothing happened. A second passed, then another. The expected agony never came. Slowly, trembling and gasping for air, Luna dared to crack open one eye, her tiny hand still trembling in front of her face. She peeked, opening her eyes just enough to catch a blur of movement. Two shadows, huge and violent, crashed together in a whirl of fur and teeth. The wolf that had lunged at her now found itself pinned under another, larger wolf. The new arrival growled, its deep, guttural warning rattling the very air. Its powerful jaws clamped onto the attacking wolf's scruff, jerking it back with savage force. Luna gasped, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She tried to crawl back, her weak arms scraping at the dirt, but her legs refused to help her escape. The battle unfolding in front of her was feral and relentless. The attacking wolf twisted and snapped, trying to free itself from the grip of the larger one. It lashed out with its claws, raking the other wolf's side, but the defender didn't relent. Instead, it surged forward, slamming its body into the attacker and sending it sprawling. The sounds were terrifying, teeth gnashing, growls so raw they seemed to shake the trees, and the dull thuds of bodies colliding with brutal force. Dust and bits of leaves flew into the air as the wolves fought, their movements primal and unrelenting. The attacking wolf managed to twist free and lunged again, aiming for the larger wolf's throat. But the defender was faster. With a calculated sidestep, it dodged the strike and retaliated with a crushing bite to the aggressor's hind leg. The smaller wolf howled in pain, its voice echoing through the dense forest. Luna couldn't look away, her wide eyes darting between the two animals. She could see the raw power of the defending wolf, the way its muscles rippled under its fur as it pressed its advantage. It wasn't just fighting, it was protecting her. The smaller wolf finally seemed to understand it was outmatched. With one last snarl, it limped backward, its tail low, its teeth bared in reluctant submission. The larger wolf didn't chase it. Instead, it stood tall, shoulders heaving as it watched the defeated predator retreat into the shadows. For a moment, the forest fell silent. Luna remained frozen, her breath shallow as the larger wolf turned toward her. It stepped closer, slow and deliberate, its massive paws crunching softly against the dirt. She flinched, her arms coming up to shield her face again. This time, there was no growl. Instead, the wolf lowered its head, sniffing at her trembling hands. Its warm breath brushed against her skin, making her shudder. Then, to her shock, it nudged its head gently against her palm. Luna gasped, her arms dropping slightly as she looked at the wolf in disbelief. It nudged her hand again, this time more insistently. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Her small fingers hesitantly reached out, hovering just above the wolf's thick fur. She hesitated, but the wolf remained still, its calm, unblinking eyes fixed on her. Finally, she let her hand fall, brushing lightly against the coarse fur atop its head. The wolf didn't flinch or pull away. Encouraged, she let her hand explore further, feeling the strength beneath its fur. Her fingers moved to its ears, and then she froze. A piece of its ear was missing. Her breath caught in her throat as her fingertips traced the jagged edge where the ear had been torn. Memories came rushing back, of a smaller wolf, trembling and injured, its frightened eyes meeting hers as she crouched beside it. "Maxi," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Is it really you?" The wolf tilted its head slightly, the movement almost inquisitive, as though it recognized the name. Tears welled up in Luna's eyes. She reached out again, her hand trembling as she gently stroked the familiar white patch on its forehead, the same patch that had reminded her of a star all those years ago. "It's you," she said, her voice stronger now. "Maxi, you came back." Luna's fingers lingered on Maxi's fur, the warmth of the wolf's body grounding her in the midst of fear and exhaustion. The sight of that familiar patch, a small white star against the dark fur, brought the past rushing back like a flood she couldn't stop, no matter how much it hurt. It had been a sunny afternoon, the kind of day where the sky seemed impossibly wide, the air crisp and sweet with the scent of pine. Luna was only 5 then, skipping between her grandparents on the narrow forest path. Henry walked ahead, his weathered hand wrapped around a sturdy walking stick, while Teresa followed close behind, carrying a small basket of wildflowers. "Grandpa, wait for me!" Luna's voice rang out, high and breathless as she stumbled over a root, but quickly caught herself. Her tiny legs were tireless that day, racing between trees and kicking up fallen leaves as though the forest were her playground. Henry chuckled, turning back just enough to see her struggling to keep pace. "The forest isn't going anywhere, little one," he teased. But Luna stopped abruptly, her attention snagged by something rustling in the undergrowth. She froze, her small frame stiffening as her eyes searched the shadows. "Grandpa," she whispered, pointing. "There's something there." Teresa caught up to her, her brow furrowed in concern. "Henry, come look." The older man sighed but turned back, brushing a hand over his wiry grey hair as he knelt beside Luna. "Probably just a squirrel," he muttered. But as he pushed aside the low-hanging branches, his breath hitched. It wasn't a squirrel. Curled up in the hollow of a bush was a small wolf pup, its thin body trembling with every shallow breath. Its fur was matted and dirty, one of its hind legs twisted at an awkward angle. The pup's dark eyes flicked upward, wide and filled with fear. "Grandpa! It's hurt!" Luna cried, her voice tinged with urgency. She dropped to her knees beside him, her little hands clutching his arm. "We have to help it." Henry frowned, glancing warily at the forest around them. "It's a wild animal, Luna. Where there's a pup, the mother's not far off." But Teresa's soft voice interjected. "Look at it, Henry. It's too weak to move, let alone call for its pack." Luna tugged at his sleeve. "Please, Grandpa, I'll take care of it, I promise." Henry sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging. "We'll bring it back to the house for now," he relented, "but only until it's strong enough to survive on its own." Luna's face lit up, her wide grin stretching ear to ear. Thank you, Grandpa. Back at the farmhouse, Luna spent every waking moment with the pup. She insisted on naming it Maxi, after noticing the small star-shaped patch of white fur on its forehead. It's like a lucky star, she explained, gently stroking the wolf's head as it lay in a nest of blankets by the hearth. Henry grumbled about the work it took to care for a wild animal, but even he couldn't suppress a faint smile when he saw how the pup's tail wagged weakly every time Luna came near. Weeks passed, and Maxi grew stronger under Luna's watchful care. She fed it scraps from her plate, cleaned its injured leg with a damp cloth, and even sang to it at night when the house was quiet. "You're my best friend," she whispered one evening, her small fingers tracing the white patch on its head. Maxi, as though understanding, licked her hand. But the day inevitably came when Henry sat Luna down and explained that Maxi had to go back to the wild. "He's a wolf, Luna, not a pet," he said gently. "It's not fair to keep him here." Luna cried and begged, but in the end, she stood beside her grandparents as Maxi was released into the woods. The wolf pup hesitated at the edge of the clearing, turning back to look at her one last time. "I'll never forget you," Luna whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Maxi had returned more than once after that, always from a distance. On quiet afternoons, when Luna played outside, she'd catch glimpses of him, a dark shape watching from the tree line. She would call his name, and though he never came closer, she always felt safer, knowing he was there. But safety had been fleeting in her life. The memory shifted, darkening. Luna's small hand curled tighter in Maxi's fur as she remembered the day everything changed. The rain had been relentless, pounding against the car's windows as her father gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "Hold on tight, sweetheart," Lucas had said, his voice steady despite the storm raging outside. Luna didn't remember the crash itself, only the sound of tires skidding, the sickening crunch of metal, and her father's arms wrapping around her, shielding her as the world went black. When she woke in the hospital, her mother was gone. Her legs gone too, in a different way. Renata had entered her life not long after, cold and impatient from the start. "It's not my job to fix your broken life," she'd muttered more than once, her voice dripping with resentment. "I didn't sign up for this." A soft whimper brought Luna back to the present. She looked up at Maxi, who nudged her hand gently with his nose, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." "I missed you," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She buried her face in his fur, letting the tears fall freely. For the first time in years, she felt the smallest spark of hope flicker inside her. Far away, down the winding paths that led to the family's farmhouse, Teresa couldn't sit still. Night had fallen long ago, and there was still no sign of Renata or Luna. The unease in her chest grew, burning like a small flame spreading through dry kindling. She stepped out onto the porch, her eyes scanning the shadows of the yard, searching for anything that might explain the silence. "Henry!" she called, her voice trembling with urgency. Henry, busy adjusting the wick on an old oil lamp in the kitchen, turned sharply at her cry. "What is it, Teresa?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. Teresa pointed to the porch steps, where a small suitcase rested, still and out of place. "That's Luna's," she said, her voice cracking. "Why is it here? Where's the child? And Renata? Why hasn't anyone told us anything?" Her eyes fell to the small, scuffed bag sitting crookedly near the front door, its pink tag hanging limp. Her chest tightened. "Henry!" she called, her voice strained. "Did you see this?" Henry shuffled out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. His weathered face creased with concern when he saw her standing rigid, one hand gripping the porch railing. "See what?" "This." Teresa pointed to the suitcase, her trembling fingers betraying her unease. Henry frowned, stepping closer. "That's Luna's." "Why's it here? Where is she?" Teresa's voice wavered, and she clutched at her cardigan, the uneasiness clawing deeper into her chest. Henry knelt, his rough hands brushing over the handle as though it might reveal some clue. "Renata must have left it," he muttered, though his tone carried no conviction. "But why leave her luggage?" Teresa asked, her words almost choked. "And not a word from Renata?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He straightened, his gaze shifting toward the woods beyond their property. The thick trees loomed, dark and unmoving, like silent witnesses. A grim certainty settled into his expression. "Something's not right," he said, his voice low. Teresa felt the same unease tighten its grip. Her mind raced through every possibility, each darker than the last. "I'll call Renata," she said quickly, turning toward the phone inside. As she dialed, her hands shook. The line rang once, then twice. By the fifth ring, her heart was pounding in her ears. No answer. She tried again and again until the mechanical beeping of the voicemail made her slam the phone down in frustration. "She's not picking up," Teresa said, her voice breaking. Henry's jaw tightened. "I'll go find her," he said firmly, already reaching for his coat. "No!" Teresa snapped, panic rising in her voice. "We don't even know where they are. What if you get lost in the woods? What if—" "I can't just sit here," Henry interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. He stepped forward and took her hands, his calloused palms warm against her cold fingers. "You stay here in case she comes back. I'll check the trails." Teresa wanted to argue, but the determination in his eyes stilled her protests. Instead, she nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling. Chuang 6. Henry Joy Matvoithu Thach. The forest was a different world at night. The familiar trails that Henry had walked 100 times now felt foreign and foreboding. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, its shaky light bouncing off gnarled tree trunks and thick underbrush. "Luna!" he called, his voice echoing into the void. "Luna, can you hear me?" The silence that followed felt heavier than the dark itself. Henry tightened his grip on the flashlight and pressed forward, the crunch of dry leaves under his boots the only sound accompanying him. "Just keep moving," he muttered to himself, pushing through low-hanging branches. Suddenly, he froze. A faint sound, like a rustle, came from the underbrush to his left. His pulse quickened. "Luna?" But as he turned, something sharp snagged his boot. He looked down just in time to see the coiled form of a snake beneath the leaves. Before he could react, pain shot through his calf like fire, and he staggered back, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "Damn it!" Henry hissed, gripping his leg as the burning spread. He lowered himself to the ground, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The snake slithered off into the dark, leaving him to wrestle with the damage it had done. He ripped off his belt and cinched it tightly above the bite, his hands trembling, but steady enough to keep the makeshift tourniquet in place. "Just a snake," he muttered through gritted teeth. "You've dealt with worse." After a few minutes, the pain dulled to a throb, though his leg felt like it weighed a ton. He grabbed the flashlight and forced himself upright, leaning heavily on a fallen branch for support. "Luna," he whispered hoarsely, his resolve unshaken. "I'm not giving up on you." Step by agonizing step, he pushed forward, calling her name into the endless night. Hours, or maybe just minutes, passed before Henry saw movement ahead. His flashlight flickered over a pair of gleaming eyes, and his heart stuttered. A wolf stood still as stone in the middle of the path, its silhouette massive and imposing. Henry's breath caught, his grip tightening on the branch he'd been using as a crutch. "Get back," he said, his voice low and steady, though his hands trembled. The wolf didn't move. Its unblinking gaze held him in place. Henry raised the branch, ready to defend himself if it lunged. But the wolf didn't snarl or bare its teeth. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying him. "What are you waiting for?" Henry muttered, his voice strained. The wolf stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Henry tightened his grip, his pulse hammering in his ears. But then the animal stopped, its head turning slightly to the side. It looked past Henry, into the woods, and let out a low, guttural sound. Not a growl, but something almost beckoning. Henry hesitated, confusion battling with his fear. The wolf looked back at him, its gaze calmer now, almost patient. It took another step forward, then paused again as though waiting. For a moment, Henry thought he was losing his mind. But something about the wolf's behavior stopped him from swinging the branch. Instead, he lowered it slowly, his breath hitching. "You're not going to hurt me, are you?" he murmured. The wolf blinked once, then turned and began walking into the darkness. It moved a few paces before stopping, glancing back at Henry as if to say, "Follow me." Henry hesitated only a moment longer before limping after it, his flashlight barely keeping up with the wolf's graceful stride. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Lead the way." As he followed, his thoughts were a tangle of worry and hope. If the wolf was leading him somewhere, maybe, just maybe, it was to Luna. The possibility spurred him on, pushing past the pain in his leg and the fear clawing at his mind. "Luna!" he called again, his voice breaking. "Hold on, Grandpa's coming." Henry stumbled forward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The pain in his leg pulsed with every step, but the fear of what might have happened to Luna pushed him on. The wolf, Maxi, though he didn't yet know it, kept moving ahead, its body a shadow that darted in and out of the narrow beam of light. Then, as the trail bent sharply, Henry saw something ahead, a faint glimmer of light, small and flickering. The wolf stopped, its ears twitching, and turned to look at him. For a moment their eyes met, and Henry swore he saw something almost human in its gaze, a silent reassurance. Without waiting for him, the wolf trotted forward into the clearing. Henry followed, gripping his flashlight tightly as the beam cut through the darkness. There she was. "Luna!" Henry's voice cracked, the name bursting from him like a cry of relief. His flashlight landed on her small frame, huddled on the ground with her back against a tree. Her face turned toward him, her tear-streaked cheeks illuminated by the weak light. "Grandpa!" she sobbed, her arms reaching out as if she couldn't believe he was really there. Henry dropped the flashlight and rushed to her, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. He fell to his knees beside her, gathering her into his arms as his breath caught in his throat. "I'm here, my little one. I'm here," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Tears streamed down his face as he held her close, feeling the frailty of her small body against him. "I'm so sorry, Luna. I should have been faster. I should have protected you." Luna clung to him, her tiny hands clutching at his coat as she cried into his shoulder. "I was so scared," she choked out. "I thought no one would find me." Henry tightened his hold on her, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'll never let you go through this again. Never." Beside them, the wolf sat quietly, its large frame silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. Its head turned slowly, its ears alert, as it scanned the darkness around them. Henry noticed its presence and stiffened for a moment, his instinct still unsure whether to trust the animal. But Luna pulled back slightly and turned her tear-streaked face toward the wolf. "Grandpa," she said, her voice trembling, "he saved me." Henry followed her gaze. "The wolf?" Luna nodded. "There was another one, a mean one. It wanted to hurt me. But he came and he stopped it. He kept me safe." Henry looked back at the wolf, his breath catching as he noticed the familiar white patch on its forehead. His mind raced, trying to place the memory, and then it clicked. "Maxi?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The wolf didn't move, but something in its posture seemed to shift. Its head lowered slightly, as if acknowledging the name. "Maxi," Henry said again, louder this time. He remembered the wolf as a pup, limping and injured, brought into their home all those years ago. The memory came flooding back, Luna's laughter as she cared for the small creature, the way it had lingered near the edge of the forest after they released it. Luna reached out a trembling hand, brushing her fingers gently against the wolf's fur. "He came back, Grandpa," she said, her voice filled with a mix of wonder and relief. "He found me." Henry stared at the wolf for a long moment before nodding, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Good boy," he said softly, his voice steady now. "Thank you for looking after her." Maxi remained still, his piercing eyes watching Henry carefully. Then, as if sensing that his job was done, he turned his gaze outward, scanning the dark woods again. Henry lifted Luna into his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. "We're going home," he whispered, his voice firm. At the farmhouse, Teresa paced back and forth across the living room, her hands wringing the edge of her shawl. The hours stretched endlessly, and the silence felt suffocating. She sat down on the edge of the couch but shot up again almost immediately, her nerves too frayed to sit still. "Where are they?" she muttered, her voice shaking. The sound of the front door creaking open made her spin around. "Henry!" she called out, her heart pounding. A figure stepped through the doorway, carrying a small bundle. When the beam of a flashlight swept across his face, Teresa gasped. "Luna!" she cried, rushing forward as Henry stepped into the light. He looked exhausted, his face pale and streaked with dirt, but the look in his eyes was steady. Teresa knelt beside him as he gently set Luna down on the couch. She immediately pulled the child into her arms, her tears spilling over as she kissed Luna's forehead. "My sweet girl," Teresa whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so scared." "I'm okay, Grandma," Luna murmured, though her voice was weak. Teresa looked up at Henry, her eyes questioning. He nodded slightly. "She's safe now," he said simply, his voice low. Teresa noticed the tear in his pant leg and the blood seeping through. "You're hurt," she exclaimed. "Just a snake bite," Henry said with a wave of his hand, his voice weary. "It can wait. What matters is that she's home." Teresa glanced down at Luna again, smoothing her damp hair back from her face. "Thank God," she whispered. As the family clung together, a faint howl echoed from the woods outside. Teresa froze, her eyes darting to the window. "It's okay," Henry said softly, his gaze following hers. "That's Maxi. He'll be watching over us." Teresa looked back at him, her expression softening as relief finally replaced her fear. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to exhale. Luna nestled into her grandmother's arms, her breathing even as sleep began to take her. And outside, somewhere in the shadows of the forest, Maxi stood guard, his eyes unblinking as he watched over the farmhouse. For days after her rescue, Luna stayed in bed, her body too weak and her spirit too shaken to do much more than whisper answers to her grandparents' questions. Teresa and Henry hovered over her like sentinels, their care unyielding, but their anger quietly simmering just beneath the surface. It was on the third night, as Teresa sat beside Luna's bed, gently stroking her hair, that the little girl spoke the words that would ignite the fire they had been trying to contain. "She hated me," Luna whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Teresa froze, her hand stilling mid-stroke. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked softly, though her chest tightened with dread. Luna turned her wide, tear-filled eyes to her grandmother. "Renata. She always said I was a burden. She said I ruined everything, that she didn't want to waste her life taking care of a cripple." Her voice cracked on the last word, and tears spilled onto her cheeks. Teresa's hand flew to her mouth as she sucked in a sharp breath. "Oh, Luna." "She wouldn't let me play outside," Luna continued, her small hands clutching at the blanket as though it could shield her from the memories. "She said it was too much work to push my chair. And if I had an accident, she'd yell at me, call me disgusting." Henry, who had been standing silently by the doorway, stepped forward, his face pale, but his jaw set with a tension Teresa hadn't seen in years. "What else, Luna?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Luna hesitated, then whispered, "Sometimes she wouldn't give me dinner. She said I didn't deserve it if I made her mad." Teresa shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That woman!" she hissed, her eyes blazing. "That vile, heartless—" She caught herself, glancing at Luna, who flinched at the outburst. "I'm sorry, my love," Teresa said, sitting back down and pulling Luna into her arms. "But I promise you this. She will never hurt you again. Never." Henry nodded, his voice calm but laced with steel. "She'll answer for what she's done. But first you need to rest. When you're better, we'll make sure this is dealt with. For good." It was a week later, after Luna had regained some of her strength, that Renata arrived unannounced at the farmhouse. Teresa saw her through the window, striding up the path as though she had every right to be there. "Oh no," Teresa muttered under her breath, setting her teacup down with a clatter. She stormed to the door and flung it open before Renata could knock. "What are you doing here?" Teresa demanded, her voice sharp. Renata looked taken aback, but quickly composed herself, smoothing the front of her coat. "I came to check on Luna," she said coolly. "I assume she's here since she didn't manage to make it home." Teresa's eyes narrowed. "Didn't manage to make it home?" she repeated, her tone dripping with incredulity. "You left her in the middle of the forest like trash. How dare you come here pretending to care?" Renata's face hardened. "Don't start with the dramatics, Teresa. You don't know what it's been like dealing with her day in and day out. Do you think I wanted this? I married her father, not his crippled daughter." The words hit Teresa like a physical blow, but she refused to let it show. She stepped forward, her voice rising. "She's a child, a helpless, sweet little girl who depended on you, and you threw her away like she was nothing. What kind of monster does that?" "I did what I had to do," Renata snapped. "Do you have any idea how hard it is caring for someone like her? I gave up my life for that kid, and all I got in return was thankless work. I was trying to make things easier for everyone." "Easier for who?" "For you." Teresa shot back, her voice shaking with fury. You abandoned her to die. You could have killed her, Renata. Don't you dare lecture me, Renata shouted, her face flushing red. You don't know what it's like, sitting here on your perfect little farm playing the doting grandparents. Where were you when I was drowning in her needs? Where were you when I had to clean up after her, feed her, bathe her? That's what being a parent means. Teresa cut in, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. You don't get to pick and choose when to care for a child. You don't get to decide they're too much and throw them away. Henry, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his voice calm but deadly serious. Enough. Renata turned to him, her mouth opening to speak, but he silenced her with a look. You've said enough, he continued, and we've heard enough. You will never come near Luna again. Do you understand me? You can't just— I can, Henry interrupted, his voice firm. And I will. If you step foot on this property again, I'll call the sheriff myself. What you did was criminal, Renata. Don't think for a second we won't make sure you answer for it. Renata's face twisted in anger, but she said nothing, her eyes darting between Henry and Teresa. Finally, with a sharp huff, she turned on her heel and stalked back down the path. Teresa sagged against the doorframe, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. Henry stepped beside her, resting a steadying hand on her shoulder. The morning air was crisp as Henry pulled the truck into the parking lot of the clinic. Teresa sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She glanced back at Luna, who sat quietly in the back seat, her legs covered with a soft blanket. You ready, sweetheart? Teresa asked, her voice gentle but steady. Luna nodded, though her small hands twisted nervously in her lap. Will it hurt? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry turned to look at her, his weathered face softening into a reassuring smile. Maybe a little, he admitted, but it'll help. We're here to help you get stronger, Luna. You're not doing this alone. Teresa reached back, placing her hand over Luna's. We're with you every step of the way, my love. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint, the bright lights glaring down on rows of chairs and gleaming equipment. A nurse guided them to a room where a doctor with a kind but no-nonsense demeanor greeted them. She's been paralyzed for how long? The doctor asked, flipping through the charts they had brought. Teresa hesitated. Since the accident, 2 years ago, she said, her voice catching slightly. The doctor frowned, setting the chart aside. 2 years is a long time, he said, his tone sharp. Why wasn't she brought in for treatment sooner? With regular therapy, she could have started recovering much earlier. Do you realize how much harder this will be now? Henry's jaw tightened, and he exchanged a glance with Teresa. They didn't need to say it aloud. Both of them knew the reason, Renata. The woman who had robbed their granddaughter not only of proper care, but of hope itself. We're here now, Henry said firmly, his voice calm but resolute. Just tell us what needs to be done. The doctor sighed, then nodded. We'll start with physical therapy, he said, motioning to the parallel bars set up across the room. It's going to take time, patience, and a lot of work. The first session was grueling. Luna's small hands gripped the bars tightly, her arms trembling as she tried to pull herself upright. Her legs dangled uselessly beneath her, and tears spilled from her eyes as she fought against her own body. I can't do it, she cried, her voice breaking. Yes, you can, Henry said, stepping closer but resisting the urge to hold her up. His fists clenched at his sides as he watched her struggle. You're stronger than this, Luna. You've got more fight in you than you think. Teresa knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's okay to cry, sweet girl. But don't give up. We're here, and we're not going anywhere. Bit by bit, Session by session, Luna began to find her strength. Acupuncture sessions to stimulate her muscles were met with hesitant whimpers, but she endured them. Her grandparents worked tirelessly, supporting her through every tear-filled setback and celebrating every small victory. Weeks turned into months. One evening, after a particularly challenging therapy session, Luna sat at the kitchen table, her legs stretched out in front of her. Her face was flushed with exhaustion, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Grandma," she said suddenly, "do you think I'll ever be able to run?" Teresa, who was stirring a pot on the stove, paused. She turned, a soft smile spreading across her face. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to, my love." Henry, sitting across the table, nodded. "Running starts with standing, and you're closer to that every day." Luna's smile wavered, and she looked down at her legs. "It feels so far away." Henry reached across the table, his large, calloused hand covering hers. "We'll get there," he said firmly, "one step at a time." The day she took her first step was quiet and unassuming, like many other therapy sessions. Henry and Teresa were by her side, holding their breath as she gripped the parallel bars. Her legs shook as she shifted her weight forward, her brow furrowing in concentration. And then, before anyone could speak, her right foot moved, just a small, trembling step, but a step nonetheless. "Luna!" Teresa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Henry's voice was hoarse. "That's it, kiddo. That's it." Luna looked up at them, her face a mixture of shock and joy. "I did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I took a step." Teresa hugged her tightly, her own tears falling freely. "You did, my love. And you're going to take so many more." Months later, the woods stretched out before Luna like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Her legs, though still shaky, carried her forward with slow, deliberate steps. Henry and Teresa walked beside her, their hands ready to steady her if she stumbled. "I want to go alone," Luna said softly, glancing at her grandparents. Henry hesitated, but Teresa nodded, touching his arm. "Let her," she said gently. With a deep breath, Luna stepped into the forest clearing where she had last seen Maxi. The sounds of the woods surrounded her, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the faint sigh of the wind. She waited, her heart pounding. "Maxi," she called, her voice steady. "It's me." For a moment, there was nothing. And then, from the shadows, a familiar shape emerged. Maxi stepped into the clearing, his silver eyes meeting hers. He was larger now, his coat thicker, but the white patch on his forehead was unmistakable. Luna's breath hitched. "You came back," she whispered. The wolf padded toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. When he reached her, he sat, his head tilted slightly as if studying her. Luna sank to her knees, her hands reaching out to touch his fur. Maxi didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his warm breath brushing against her face. "I missed you," she said, her voice trembling. "You never gave up on me, did you?" Maxi let out a soft huff, his eyes calm and unwavering. For a long time they stayed there in the clearing, the girl and the wolf, bound by a connection deeper than words. When Luna finally stood, Maxi rose beside her, his presence steady and unyielding. As she turned to walk back toward her grandparents, Maxi remained in the clearing, watching her with an almost human understanding. When she reached the edge of the woods, Luna glanced back. Maxi stood silhouetted against the trees, his head raised as he let out a long, mournful howl. Luna smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. Henry and Teresa embraced her as she stepped back into their arms, the warmth of their love surrounding her. The howl faded into the distance, but its meaning lingered, a promise, a farewell, and a reminder that she would never be alone again. Together they turned toward home, the forest behind them, and a future filled with hope ahead. Hey everyone, thank you for sticking around until the end of this story. First off, I want to say that this is just a fictional tale. None of the events or characters are real. But what makes this story hit so hard is that, sadly, there are children in the real world who face situations far worse than what Luna went through. Not every child has a loving, safe home. Some are left to fend for themselves in ways that leave scars, physical, emotional, or both, that can last a lifetime. And unlike Luna, who found her way back to hope and healing with the love of her grandparents, many kids don't get that chance. What this story teaches us is that neglect and cruelty are never, ever justified. Luna's struggles remind us how fragile a child's spirit is and how much damage can be done when the people meant to protect them turn their backs. It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in looking out for vulnerable children, whether they're in our families, communities, or even just someone we happen to notice is struggling. But there's also hope. Luna's recovery shows us how love and care can heal, no matter how broken things seem. Her bond with Maxi symbolizes loyalty and protection, something we should all strive to offer to those in need. So now I want to hear from you. What did this story make you think or feel? Have you ever seen or experienced anything like this in your life? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And remember, kindness, attention, and care can change someone's life. Let's be that for someone. See you next time.